With the announcements, and I'll pass it off to you, Joe. Welcome, everybody. Today is the Southfield MiSec chapter discussion where we're talking about Microsoft 365 security best practices. We are meeting on Zoom today. Hopefully, we'll be in person next month. We do have a social coming up at the end of the month at LFG Royal Oak. We hoped you would join us. It's going to be on the 29th at 6 p.m. MiSec Ann Arbor meets the second Monday of every month. Jackson is the second Tuesday. Lansing and Detroit are on the second Wednesday, and Grand Rapids and Southfield are on the second Thursday. If you have a topic for a talk or wish to give a talk or a workshop, please reach out to me. We're always looking for additional speakers and workshops. If you enjoy writing about security, we are looking for blog posters, so please reach out to me. Join us on Discord. That's where we are have transitioned to now instead of Slack. And that is pretty much it for all the announcements. I'm going to hand it over to Joe, our speaker. Thank you, Joe. It's all yours.
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Joe Stocker. I'm a Microsoft MVP and the founder of Patriot Consulting. We focus on Microsoft security deployments. Today, we'll be going over everything we've learned over the last 5 years in defending Office 365. We've conducted a number of incident responses and seen what works, seen what doesn't work, and really excited about being here today with you guys. And I welcome the interaction, the questions. So please disrupt me. But we're going to cover identity, email security, and endpoint. In my opinion, it's kind of that order. If you think about anything in the cloud, it needs to be secured when it comes to identity. And then attackers oftentimes, 90% of the time, they use, phishing attacks to try to penetrate an org. And then finally, the endpoint is kind of that last line of defense, right? So I think these are really the most important aspects of Microsoft 365 security. And we'll be looking at it from a defender's perspective. We'll also be looking at it from, assuming that you're using the Microsoft licensing. I totally understand there's other ways to do security, third parties, but we're going to be looking at it primarily from a Microsoft perspective today, since that's my specialty and expertise. And first, a little bit of fun. This is my favorite meme from Print Nightmare. So there's a patch, right? So I just have to apply the patch and it's fixed. Oh, gosh, this just cracks me up. So funny. You look at the really complex, diagrams that are out there, people trying to understand what works, am I, truly protected from this thing? Anyway, I just thought I'd start off with a little bit of fun. But one of the things that's really happened over the last couple of years is just I love this phrase, the GitHubification of InfoSec. There's just so much. This is an article by John Lambert from Microsoft. There's so many tools out there that have just been released that are available. I know it's kind of controversial. Some people think that the tools shouldn't be on GitHub. It arms too many people. I'm definitely of the opinion that we want to see it so we can defend against it, so we can test our defenses. So I was a little bit disheartened over the last couple of weeks when GitHub started taking down tools. Pretty much around, I believe, the Exchange vulnerability timeframe. They just felt like the proof of concept code was too dangerous. And, hopefully they limit that to those kind of scenarios and it doesn't become wider spread. So anyway, that's my pitch on that. So this particular slide from John Lambert's been kind of converted over into the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So you can actually, go into MITRE ATT&CK and you can map, various TTPs into Microsoft 365, which is pretty helpful. And then just to set some context here, we're seeing the costs of exploit kits decrease. We're seeing, ransomware as a service, obviously on the rise, but basically just attack services are decreasing, making it more accessible to a much larger group of attackers. So we're going to, that's kind of the context of what we're facing as defenders. And so we're going to move into some real practical recommendations on what you could do to harden, Microsoft 365. Step number one, or I think one of the most important things, is to really consider disabling SMS-based MFA. Even though Microsoft does state that SMS MFA, if you enable it, will prevent 99% of account takeovers. That's based on Microsoft studies, they have all the telemetry, they can see all the attacks. The issue is that, and you guys may have seen this on recently, the Vice article, there's vulnerabilities. There's been vulnerabilities for a long time, but I loved this headline. A hacker got all my texts for $16. Gaping hole allowed the hacker to basically, take over any kind of, web service that was protected by SMS-based MFA. And there's just been so many really well done presentations. At RSA, there was the KnowBe4 presentation a couple of years ago, where 12 different ways to bypass MFA, and so clearly this is not what should be enabled by default. PCI does not recommend it. NIST is prohibiting it as well. So we do recommend going in, because it is enabled by default, we do recommend turning that off. And today, primarily this is done in this classic MFA settings menu. This is when, back when Microsoft acquired a company called Phone Factor many years ago, same kind of administration interface. This is soon getting replaced. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But you ideally want to turn off call to phone, text messaging. There's some common objections I hear from clients on, the problems that would cause. And we'll talk about some solutions for those issues. But, for these reasons, we would definitely recommend this is one of the first things to do to harden Office 365. So instead of that, you would use the Authenticator app. And in the Authenticator app, it's available for iOS and Android. You can, of course, use third-party Authenticator apps too. So if you prefer Google Authenticator, or Duo, or, Okta, several other choices are available, but this is the one that comes, with all the licensing from Microsoft. The key advantage this has over the third parties is it's available in passwordless, and you actually have self-service password reset built right in. The benefit here, it's immune to those SMS issues like SIM card swapping, phone number porting. You don't have to be on a mobile VPN to use it. But there is a weakness that we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about in a moment, a very specific attack, man-in-the-middle proxy attack. We'll talk about a specific piece of software that does that. That's very effective at defeating even Authenticator app. One of the pain points that users complain about and organizations are reluctant to push MFA out is because most organizations have BYOD, like where they don't want to pay for people's phones, right? So everybody is encouraged to bring their own personal phone, because then the organization doesn't have to pay for cell phone plans and people's phones. Although some states like California have laws that say that employers are supposed to pay or reimburse when that is the case. But this is really an issue. Users oftentimes do not want to install company apps on their personal phone. They think they're getting tracked, and they just have privacy concerns. So some solutions, if that blocker comes up as needed, you can present kind of a fallback option of presenting a hardware token or a FIDO2 security key as like a backup. So what I typically do is I recommend to organizations deploying MFA, try encouraging people to install the Authenticator app, and then almost on an exception basis, when people push back, that's when you can have distribute the hardware tokens and FIDO2 keys. So a lot of city and county governments where that's worked really well for them as a strategy for deploying MFA. Interestingly, GPS location has now been added. So in the past, we had, conditional access policies that would be looking at like geographic region or country. And so now we can get, much more accurate with GPS location. But of course, that goes back to this privacy concern, because the user has to consent to that. And it sort of feels like, okay, is my company now tracking my location? And whereas in reality, we're trying to use it to make sure that it's, not a hacker and, who's just jumping off a Tor exit node inside the United States, right? So soon we're going to have the ability to show the user the geographic map and location sign-in. So if you get the push notification, it's going to show you the location, very similar to, on Apple iCloud, when you sign in, you get a location of where that sign-in is coming from. So that's coming to Authenticator soon. So some tips here. We do recommend disabling the push notification choice. So we talked about disabling, text. The reason why we recommend disabling push notification, there's a couple reasons. It's because the more MFA prompts that people receive, the more they just start rubber stamp, approval without thinking, right? So think about it when you're getting MFA prompts all the time. If you're an end user, some organizations are you really have this kind of old school thinking, like we're going to prompt everybody once an hour for MFA, right? And so the users just get used to hitting approve. Well, what happens if an attacker, recovers the password from uh, the dark web or password recycling and other ways they can obtain passwords, phishing and whatnot. So the attacker now just has to get lucky and allow the user to approve the push notification. I've responded to security incidents where companies got hacked because the users made mistakes and accepted the push notification. So that definitely is a problem. So the other issue is that the Android store has at least 3 applications the last time I checked that allow users to auto accept any kind of MFA prompt. So that's a problem that defeats the whole purpose of MFA. So what you're left with is like that rotating, OTP code or a hardware token. Those would be the most secure options. And we do, in general, recommend using a conditional access policy to not do any kind of prompt or not require any kind of code whatsoever, as long as the user is coming from a trusted device. So if you're, you know, depending on your threat model, if you're modeling against a local attacker who steals the laptop while the laptop is unlocked, that's a different kind of threat model than say a foreign hacker who doesn't have access to one of your trusted devices, right? So in general, I do think this is probably the stronger way to go in terms of security is not over prompting people because then they just get used to those things and really prefer the trusted device. And we have, much more to say on that, but one other thing I wanted to mention is that these options are getting moved. So out of this older portal, they're all getting moved over to the Azure portal under authentication methods. So this will eventually be going away here pretty soon, probably this year. And what's going to end up happening is you'll be able to assign users and groups to each of these authentication methods. So you'll be able to essentially say, for text messaging, I want this call center group to be able to use it. Probably a bad example. And then for my domain administrators, I only want these more secure options to be used. So you'll be able to mix and match groups based on authentication methods. So that is coming. Another tip, it is recommended now to disable the Remember MFA on Trusted Device checkbox. So this particular checkbox was a legacy setting that allowed MFA to persist between browser sessions. The problem is that it expired the MFA token for rich clients, which really became an issue because for users, they started getting multiple MFA prompts when that token would expire for each rich client app. And so that's clearly not a good experience to, have to sign into, an MFA for multiple applications. So the recommendation is to not use this checkbox. And instead, if you have conditional access, it's to use sign-in frequency if you need to expire tokens. Of course, if you, like I said before, if your threat model is not that local person stealing the laptop because you trust that, the laptop, lock screen is going to, tighten up the lock screen, you BitLocker encryption, various things. Again, depending on the threat model, this is a, you can do this. We're not necessarily saying you should do this, but if you had some sort of policy saying that you have to re-MFA people periodically, this is now the preferred method over this one because it's just a better experience for rich clients. So you'll have less help desk tickets, you'll have less pain if you use this method rather than the older method. So the reality is not all customers, have the Azure AD P1 license to do conditional access. That's a $6 per user per month cost. So for those users that don't have that, then just basically the Microsoft best practice is check this box, but then bump it up to 90 days. That is the new default. So if you were to configure a new tenant, you're going to find that that's checked and that's 90 days. So, and here's the hyperlink there. Okay, so what about those users that, I mentioned, hardware tokens and YubiKeys as an alternative for users that just do not want to install the Authenticator app on their phone. Hey, it's my personal device, and I get that. I personally feel like if a company wants employees to be using devices for security, the company should probably provide that. So these tokens, they run about $20 each. The reason I'm highlighting these two, DeepNet and Token 2, is because in particular, these two manufacturers support Azure AD natively, meaning there's no server infrastructure required whatsoever. So you basically import a CSV file and it seeds the token with Azure AD, and then you distribute them. So this is a great way to go, pretty reasonable in the cost. Now, this is not something I'd lead with. I would say that this would be a fallback option if people do not want to use their phones for MFA. And there's some other options to consider when we start looking at all the available MFA options. So we talked about how text messaging is weak, and we talked about the Authenticator apps available. We talked about the hardware tokens. You can also enable Windows Hello for Business is actually considered an MFA qualified authentication method. So if you have Windows Hello for Business enabled in your environment, that will satisfy the MFA claim in conditional access. So if your organization says we have to have MFA and you're signing into Windows Hello for Business, then you will not get a push notification on your phone. Azure AD is smart enough to know that this qualifies as a 2FA solution, which is controversial. A lot of people like to argue that, fact, is a PIN really more secure than a password? The blast radius of the PIN is contained to that one device, right? If someone shoulder surfs that PIN, they can't use a PIN on a different device. So in that one case, I would agree that a PIN is more secure than a password. It is FIDO2 certified as well. And a lot of people don't realize that you can actually require a Bluetooth signal or network device proximity as a multi-factor unlock requirement. So if you wanted to do facial recognition or fingerprint and then have additional factors, you can actually configure additional factors to unlock a device. So that is an option there. The Authenticator app can be enabled in passwordless mode. I'll tell you exactly how to do that in a moment. And this will use a number matching technique. So rather than that push notification that the user might just rubber stamp and just approve every time, they'll be presented with 3 different numbers that they have to match what is displayed on the screen. So at least there's only a 30% or 33% chance that the user might accidentally allow the hacker in. And then we have FIDO2 security keys. Number of manufacturers make these now. And not only is this nice for not having to type in a password, it's a alternative to typing in a password, but it also solves a problem with Windows Hello for Business. Windows Hello for Business is a one-for-one, one-to-one solution, so it does not support a shared workstation. So if you have like a manufacturing floor and you need multiple people to do SSO with no password, then that's where you have to use the security keys. The other benefit of using the FIDO2 key is that it supports what's called origin binding, which is a defense against phishing. So FIDO2 security key, for those that don't know, when you first register it to a site, it cryptographically, stores a key on the device that is matched with the website it authenticated to. So anyone that sends you a phishing link down the road, as soon as you attempt to authenticate with the FIDO2 security key, it recognizes that's not the same site that I originally registered to. So this is also a effective defense against man in the middle, which we'll talk more about. To enable passwordless in your tenant, you go into the authentication methods, you find FIDO2 security key, and then you just turn it on. You could also turn it on for a group of users if you want to test it out before turning it on for the whole tenant. So that's kind of step 1. You have to turn it on at the tenant level. And then step 2 is you also have to make sure that your tenant is enabled in what's called the combined registration experience. So the combined registration experience means that when users are registering for MFA, they're also dual registering for self-service password reset. So even if you don't have self-service password reset enabled in your tenant, you do have to have this particular, registration experience enabled in order to use the FIDO2 registration experience. And then you start distributing the keys. Once those two tenant settings are configured, the user has to manually register the FIDO2 key. So unlike the hardware tokens that I was talking about previously, where you just import a CSV file, in this particular case, the user does have to go through a self-registration process. There's no current way that IT can automate this. So this is probably the greatest hindrance of why security tokens, FIDO2 tokens are probably not getting adopted as much, as I think IT generally has this fear that their end users can't figure this out. So at a minimum, what we recommend is distributing these to domain administrators, high value targets, anyone that is being targeted with phishing. Google announced that they distributed these to, I think, 80,000 users, and they claim to have not had a phishing incident since then. Phishing, at least in regard to attacking identity, because again of the FIDO2 pairing. So this is basically the process to get that deployed. So not all user-based MFA authentication options are created equal. Depending on the type of option, there's various vulnerabilities. But in general, whether it's the Authenticator app, Windows Hello, or FIDO2 key, those are generally considered the best. And you generally would want to kind of move away from the other options. So, but the problem with all user-based MFA options, except the FIDO2 security key, is that they're all vulnerable to man-in-the-middle attacks. So Evil Jinx is a man-in-the-middle piece of software that you can download on GitHub. It takes probably about an hour to set up. You do have to purchase a domain name. And once it's set up, if you can convince a user to click on the phishing link that this generates, the lure that it generates, then the Evil Jinx server is basically going to capture the authentication token issued by the IDP. So whether that's Google or Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft Office 365, they're all vulnerable to this user-based MFA threat. So at my company, we actually were targeted with one of these links. So we immediately noticed it was a proxy server, and it was interesting to see, this is not just a hypothetical. Hackers are definitely using this technique. I've also seen customers get successfully phished using this method. And I think we're going to see this more and more as MFA adoption rises. And so like there's level 1 MFA where everybody's deploying MFA with just user-based MFA, whether it's text messaging or the Authenticator app. That's kind of like they're checking the box and telling their cyber security insurance carriers, hey, MFA is deployed, we're good. The problem, and I've been saying this now for 3 years since this came out in like 2019 and probably earlier, that this is not difficult for the attacker to set up. There's no coding required. You just have to buy a domain name, host a server, and you're able to phish this. So the author states that this particular hack is able to defeat any form of 2FA. And when I saw this claim, I thought, surely that can't be the case, right? There's got to be a way to defend against this. So I wrote an article. If you do a Google or Bing search for defending against Evil Jinx, I think the top search result is an article I wrote on the various different techniques that can be used to defend against this. And the summary, the 4 that I recommend for defending against a man-in-the-middle attack is device authentication, and I'll go through both of those methods in a moment. You can also use a CASB solution, like Microsoft's CASB is an example that does certificate-based authentication, because then even if the attacker had the token, if they try to go to replay it, Microsoft's going to check for a certificate. So I verified and tested that these are both able to block Evil Jinx. So I actually set up an Evil Jinx server. I ran through the test, and that goes back to my earlier point. That's why I think we really need GitHub to continue to allow us to have those security tools, those hacking tools available, because as a defender, how can we actually test the effectiveness of our defense solutions if we don't have access to the same hacking tools that hackers have? So I think it's really important that GitHub not, remove security tools from GitHub. FIDO2 security keys, as I mentioned, are effective. And then IP fencing should really be a last resort. I think they should be a last resort just because of all the pain. If you're remote, you have to be on a VPN. That's really not the best user experience. Due to COVID, we realized that a lot of VPNs couldn't scale. The Zoom traffic and video conferencing traffic had to be, partial split tunneled off and everything. So there's just a lot of issues with requiring VPN and IP fencing. So, and it's really the old castle moat. It's not zero trust. I mean, if you're trusting everything that originates, well, what if someone brings in a malicious laptop and you're basically saying, I trust everything from this IP range? So this really, should be a last resort. We do recommend, device authentication is probably the simplest. And this is the article that I was referring to before. I tested, I think, 12 total methods, and these are the 4 that I think are the most effective. Another security recommendation we have for identity is to move off of ADFS. And so if we go back to what happened in SolarWinds, the attackers often would pivot and move vertically meaning from on-prem to cloud, by essentially stealing the ADFS token signing certificate and perform what's called a golden SAML attack, where they can mint their own authentication tokens. And so because of that, in December, the NSA, and they don't issue too many memos, they typically rely on CISA to do that. They issued a memo stating, and I thought, I was actually quite surprised that they got into a very, very specific vendor, recommendation. Consider using Azure AD as the authentication provider. So they basically looked at the difficulty of securing ADFS, just like it's very difficult to secure your domain controllers. And once the attacker becomes a domain admin, if they can move over to the ADFS server, get the token signing cert, they can essentially mint authentication. So the NSA is saying, yeah, you should probably move off of ADFS over to Azure AD. So I did a webinar, the top 8 reasons to move off of ADFS. And, I think the first reason is just the surface attack area. There's been a number of, CVEs and remote code executable vulnerabilities. You can also enumerate any ADFS server by simply changing the ADFS namespace here and putting this at the end, and you'll be able to enumerate all of the apps that organization uses. They fixed this on newer versions of ADFS, but there's still quite a bit of older ADFS out there. So, we don't want to enumerate too much information to the attacker and arm them too much. That can be used in social engineering and other attacks against an organization. ADFS can have multiple single points of failure unless it's designed properly. And so what does that mean? That means you end up with like all kinds of complexity, with load balancers, external load balancers, internal load balancers. You've got dependencies on virtualization stacks and, SQL servers and just all sorts of complexity. So you can avoid all that complexity by migrating, from ADFS to Azure AD. I think anyone that's been in an organization with ADFS is aware of the pain of the certificate maintenance, the token signing certificate. When that thing expires, you actually have to go and do metadata exchange with all the relying party trusts, and that's disruptive. There's outages associated with that. There's many other reasons. If you're interested in kind of hearing me explain all those, you can go to this ADFS webinar, and it's a full webinar just on all the reasons to try to get off of ADFS. When people hear password hash sync and the alternative to ADFS is to sync your passwords to the cloud, or the other option is pass-through authentication, we often hear, but passwords in the cloud are not safe, right? Well, technically, the way Microsoft syncs passwords, the password's not really stored in the cloud. It's a salt that can't be reversed. So for people that are really into cryptography, they know that this PBK DF2 key is the hardest, cryptography to break out there. It takes a long time to brute force this. So to give you an idea of how difficult it is, how do we compare this with the difficulty of cracking a NTDS.dit database? NTDS can be brute forced at about 418 million keys per second. So if someone obtains a physical copy of that, let's say that a hacker, physically got into Microsoft and somehow got, a copy of the salt. This particular algorithm is so slow, password crackers crawl at 74 keys per second. So not 418 million, but 74 total keys per second. So you can make an argument that, I think the passwords are probably safer in Azure AD than they are in on-premise Active Directory. And especially if you add multi-factor authentication and device authentication in order to even get access to it, that's typically much stronger than controls that people are able to put around AD. I've been to hundreds of customer environments, and I rarely see 802.1x security controls in place. Like when you plug in a laptop, 802.1x is checking, the health and the compliance and state of the device to make sure it's healthy before it can actually access AD. I don't see that often. Extremely rare to see a proper 802.1x, implementation that does posture checking on devices before they access a network. So anyway, I think this is generally considered, pretty secure. Pass-through authentication is still better than ADFS because it's not public facing, so you're not getting attacks from the internet. This is shielded behind your firewall, so this is still better, even if you're not convinced by this argument. The other way to defend against man in the middle is to do device authentication. So, I mentioned, IP fencing and the drawbacks of that, and we talked about FIDO2 security keys, but using Intune enrollment is actually a very effective defense mechanism against man in the middle, because Intune, when you enroll the device in Intune, it actually issues a certificate to the device, and then it's basically performing certificate-based authentication behind the scenes. In addition to that, it also is able to check the health of the device. So it's basically able to say, is there a firewall on there? Is BitLocker enabled? Is the antivirus installed? And this does support third-party AV detection as well. So any AV that can register in the security center, can be factored into a compliance check. But there's nothing perfect out there. This is vulnerable to an attack. It's about probably 18 months old now, called Pass the PRT. We'll talk more about Pass the PRT on the next slide, but I would say that this is probably one of the easier solutions to implement, and probably the overall best solution to implement to defend against that man-in-the-middle phishing solution. This is cross-platform. It supports Windows, Mac, iOS, Android, and if you have a Windows-only environment, it's already built natively into Windows 10. So it's the deployment, I'd say, is not as complex as other solutions. So what is Pass the PRT? So first of all, what's a PRT? So a primary refresh token is issued under certain scenarios. And so depending on how the device is joined to Azure AD, if it's Windows 10 device, it can get a primary refresh token either via hybrid Azure AD join, which is simply a domain joined machine that is synced with password hash sync. Azure AD join. If it's an iOS device, it's got the Authenticator app. If it's an Android or Mac, it's got the Intune company portal. So these methods here are ways that you can actually obtain a primary refresh token. And a primary refresh token can be stolen, similar to how the EvilJinx solution is able to basically steal the authentication token from any user-based MFA. This application called Road Tools was written to basically take the PRT off the device and replay it, which means that if you've strongly authenticated with Intune or hybrid Azure AD join, you have this token on the device that could be lifted and then replayed on a different device. And so this is definitely, a concern. And especially when when Mimikatz decided to weaponize that code into Mimikatz to make it, pretty much available for anyone to use that. So it does mean that the battle has kind of shifted now to that endpoint, because if the attacker is able to get to the endpoint, now they can lift the PRT and replay that on a different device in order to access whatever Azure IDP has access to. So SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, any third-party SaaS application that's federated to Azure AD. So it's a reasonable threat. So the solutions for Microsoft to defend against past the PRT is to implement what's called a attack surface reduction rule. So this particular rule will block processes from extracting data from the local security authority service, and that would be the prevention solution. And then the detection solution would be to deploy an EDR solution to be detecting processes that are touching and interacting with LSAS. So I tested this out. I actually got a copy of that latest build of Mimikatz and attempted to steal the PRT after enabling ASR. And I can definitely confirm that when you get in there and actually attempt to run this particular command here is the one that steals the PRT. If you have the attack surface reduction rule enabled, you will get an error message. So I did confirm that the attack surface reduction rule is definitely effective at this particular technique. So I think that's an important hardening step to do. As we saw with the Kaseya attack, the attackers are getting extremely clever in their techniques. So I think these defense solutions are important to implement. The second man-in-the-middle defense is to implement what's called hybrid domain join. So hybrid domain join, the reason why it can guard against man-in-the-middle is because if the attacker steals the authentication token and then they attempt to replay it, conditional access policy can say, well, that's still not a device. This is not originating from a device that I trust or I'm aware of. And so this definitely has the benefit of blocking man in the middle. I tested it, it does work. And it also has the benefit of preventing people from using their personal Windows machines at home, which I think is pretty important because, who knows if those machines are already infected. You have to kind of assume breach these days, assume it's already been, everyone's machine's already owned, right? And so I think preventing machines from connecting to your network that are not, corporate managed, I think is an important concept. And, people call that zero trust, but that's fundamentally what we're doing. Requiring traditional on-prem AD means that we can't use this solution for Macs. And that's why we recommended Intune first for device authentication. Also, there's a fairly good trend right now with organizations that want to migrate from on-premise Active Directory to Azure AD. We're seeing more and more CIOs and folks ask us, okay, why do I still need Active Directory? We can't defend against attacks against AD, right? Just look at Print Nightmare and the attacks against domain controllers. So a lot of organizations are trying to move to just that pure Azure AD environment. And so this particular solution does not support pure Azure AD. You really, at that point, need to go to Intune compliance. The vulnerability of hybrid domain join, like Intune, is past the PRT. And so, again, we need to make sure that we're implementing the attack surface reduction rule to prevent that from getting lifted. One of the other, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the slide, but I see a lot of people enabling what's called seamless SSO in their Azure AD Connect servers. This is an option that allows users to authenticate without having to type in a username and password. This is typically something people turn on when they migrate away from ADFS, but it's not advantageous because the machine has to have line of sight to a domain controller. So if someone's working from home, then they're not getting an SSO experience. So the solution is to obtain a primary refresh token using those domain join mesh methods I mentioned on a different slide, just to recap those. Hybrid domain joining your machine will get a PRT, or Azure AD joining will issue a PRT. Those are better SSO options than enabling seamless SSO. And so the other interesting thing is when you enable Windows Hello for Business, that also creates a PRT. So that's pretty cool. PRTs are stamped with an MFA claim so that users are not getting MFA prompts from conditional access. So the primary benefit here is it's independent of a network location. We don't need line of sight to a domain controller. And so this would be a superior option than using seamless SSO. Another SSO option available is Enterprise SSO for Apple devices. This is new, it's in preview. You can go to bit.ly Apple SSO, and it enables SSO on both Mac and iOS and iPad. Let me jump ahead to a few other tips here. We do recommend enabling what's called continuous access evaluation. This allows you to enforce in near real time when somebody changes network location. I see a fair amount of organizations that have implemented IP fencing. They've found out that if you have an IP fence where you're saying, okay, we only allow people inside the network to authenticate. Well, what happens is if you get an authentication token and then you leave with a laptop, that authentication token is still valid. So people can leave that IP fence. They can go to Starbucks. They still have an authentication token, and now they're working in a potentially compromised network with a authentication token, still accessing cloud resources. So if that's you, if your organization has IP fencing, it's recommended to enable continuous access evaluation, because then if somebody does change their network location, then the authentication is reevaluated in near real time. Also, if you reset someone's password or you need to terminate someone, normally without this feature, it can take like up to an hour, depending on the rich client, in order to check back in to see if that token has been invalidated. So this is a feature that's off by default, but you can certainly go in and turn it on. We also recommend enabling what's called banned password lists, or custom banned password lists. So come up with all sorts of variations of passwords that you do not want users to use, and then Microsoft will merge that with their own custom banned password list and prevent people from using those as part of their password when they go to change their password. We also recommend blocking legacy authentication. Legacy authentication will bypass conditional access MFA policies. So this is another area that really raises eyebrows. When people finish their MFA deployments, they typically stop. They don't realize that IMAP and POP and these other protocols will still allow the attacker to authenticate and access a user's mailbox, even if you've enabled MFA. And so the attacker just needs to brute force the username and password, and they're able to get right in. So the disabling legacy authentication can be done via policy. So you can, come in here and, check this box. About 12 months ago, Microsoft updated the code so that any new conditional access policy will automatically include legacy authentication. So in the past, you had to create a separate conditional access policy if you wanted to explicitly, block legacy auth. You no longer have to do that if it's a brand new created policy. But for organizations that had older policies that have not been updated, you still have to go in and explicitly create a new policy to block legacy authentication. The other option is you deploy what's called always on MFA. So this is that older, style of MFA that was in that kind of classic MFA portal. This by default does block legacy authentication as well. So this would be the best option if you don't own the Azure AD P1 licensing, or if it's a budget issue. The downside here is you can't create exceptions for various conditions. So, the conditional access policies are considerably more flexible. So some of the tips, and the reason I'm bringing this up is many of the account compromises that we investigate is because people have not disabled legacy authentication. So this is still a very big deal. I saw a statistic recently that said only 16% of organizations have disabled legacy auth. So it's pretty important thing to do. So you should first start out running report only mode so you can generate a list of the users and applications that are still using legacy auth, and modernizing your Office clients so that so when you shut off legacy auth, you're not going to brick all your users. Gradually transition people over to the Outlook mobile app so you can eventually turn off ActiveSync. And then, once you've done your due diligence here, then you could switch from report only mode to block mode. And then also don't forget to disable the MFA app passwords, because that's also, by its very definition, a way to bypass MFA. Another very important thing to do in security is to really guard against these OAuth illicit attacks. So OAuth attacks is when an attacker creates a fake application and they basically will call it like, OneDrive or SharePoint. And if the user clicks accept, the attacker will maintain persistent access to that user's account. Even if you reset the user's password, even if you enable MFA, the attacker still dwells in the account. So I've responded to a number of attacks where the attacker gained access to the account. They immediately granted themselves access to an app, so that, because they knew they were going to get discovered eventually, right? So they used this method to maintain persistent even after IT had attempted to remediate and try to kick the attacker out. The attacker was still in there. So by the time I got in there, I noticed in the audit log that the attacker had granted access to an app during the time frame that they had access to the account. And so this is a method attackers definitely use to maintain persistence, or even the initial access can be done via this way too. So there's 3 solutions to defend against this. First option is you just turned off end user consent. This is not very practical because it would break things like DocuSign and legitimate, business apps that need access to people's data. So the other 2 options would be to use like a CASB solution like Microsoft Cloud Obscurity that can monitor for those fake apps. Or you can just reroute the users to an administrator. So whenever they get one of these, they click approve, it's just going to go to a global admin to review that, or whoever you designate to review that.
Got a quick question for you, Joe.
Sure.
I could be wrong here, but I remember seeing something that could be set up in Security Center to alert against, I guess, unapproved app, access being granted in either some form or another, but around just what you're showing here, the 365 application.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen that? And how practical is that?
Yeah, so I believe what that does is that links you over to Microsoft Cloud App Security, which is actually where that policy is homed. And it's pretty effective because what it's doing is it's looking at the prevalence of the app. So if the app is claiming to be Outlook, but they've seen that the worldwide adoption of that particular app is only like 3 people, then they know that that is not, a real app. So they have access to that signal that you and I don't have access to. So you and I as an administrator, we would never be able to be as accurate as a system like that, because they have access to how many people worldwide are also using that app, right? So I think it's important, if you own the E5 licensing, I would definitely turn that policy on. If you don't own it and you only have Azure AD P1, then I would definitely do option 3 to route the consent to an admin. If you have the least amount of licensing, like Office E3 only, your only option is to do option 1, is just to disable all user consent. And then what that means is that the administrator would have to manually consent to the app. So yeah, good question. Attack Simulator is a tool that you can use to basically determine if people have weak passwords. So it's really important, if you've not deployed MFA, to see if people are, if they have weak passwords. So what's clever or cool about this is it gets around that that encryption delay that Microsoft would normally implement to prevent brute forcing of the password. So they essentially allow you to brute force your own passwords. You have to MFA as an administrator first, because clearly this would be dangerous in the wrong hands. But they essentially allow you to upload a dictionary and brute force yourself and find out who's got weak passwords. So it's pretty cool. If you've got MFA deployed, though, it doesn't matter as much that people have weak initial passwords, because your second and third factors, hopefully you have device authentication. Those are more important, I think, than passwords. It does require an E5 license. So summarizing the identity best practices here, definitely good to turn on MFA. According to Microsoft, that'll prevent 99% of kind of like drive-by attacks. But if you're in the crosshairs of an APT threat group or a cybercrime group, you got to take it a little bit further and really enable device authentication. Otherwise, you're going to see those man-in-the-middle, attacks targeting your users. That's going to require an Azure AD P1 license, so you can verify domain join. That's limited to Windows 10 only. So if you have Macs or other devices, then you're really going to need to do Intune compliance, so you can do device authentication there. If you don't want to go down either of those routes, then the last resort is IP fencing. So preventing external authentication unless they're on your VPN. And then at that point, you're essentially using your VPN client as a factor of authentication, because maybe it's hard to, get that. Although Colonial was hacked through a VPN software, so maybe your VPN is better than theirs. I don't know. User behavior checking, session risk. These are additional capabilities with the P2 licenses or above to be able to determine, at the time of sign in, is the user signing in from a device that's got previous signal from Microsoft that it was a botnet. Microsoft works with the Digital Crimes Unit to take over botnets worldwide. They do domain takeovers, and then it's kind of neat. They suddenly are receiving all the signals from those infected devices, so they know exactly which devices are infected. So that's part of the intelligence security graph in the ML engine. Impossible travel, leaked credentials, Tor web browser. So if Microsoft detects a Tor web browser or NordVPN or those types of anonymizing VPNs, it'll block those sign-ins. So essentially, if you had the licensing, you'd want to turn that on, because that's going to, block those really risky sessions from signing in. We also mentioned, just to recap, blocking legacy authentication. Of course, that's good. Banning common passwords, redirecting those OAuth requests to an admin, enabling continuous access evaluation. I hope everyone's deployed Laps for your domain joined workstations. That's really good to do. It's a free utility, not very difficult to deploy. I actually got a really good walkthrough article for anyone that hasn't deployed this, but really helps reduce the speed of lateral movement in an organization. It's not perfect, and there's actually good alternatives out there to Labs, but hey, it's free. Use something, I guess, is the the importance. And then, of course, migrating from ADFS to Azure AD if you haven't done that. So these would be, some of the identity best practices. So Stephen and others, I do have some tips on email security and some tips on endpoint security. If you'll, I know we're kind of at the end of the 1 hour, but if you'll allow me to continue, I have some more to share with you guys if you guys are interested.
By all means, go for it. I do have a question from YouTube for you.
Sure.
I pasted it in the chat here. It was around after you log in as admin, being able to brute force the passwords. The question was, when it comes to checking passwords, Microsoft, I'm assuming they are not very good when it comes to detecting weak passwords initially. Is there a different, I guess, set of tools or different types of checks it's doing from a traditional password check when you first sign up for the service, or is it the same?
I think the solution there is to make sure that they enable what's called this password protection feature, because this will enforce common passwords. So like summer 2021 exclamation point, or your own company names and those sorts of things. Microsoft essentially is scoring passwords and using their telemetry to prevent weak passwords, but it's not on by default. So you'd want to go in and turn this on, and this would be one thing. And then after the fact, because again, this would only take effect on a go forward basis. And then if you're following the NIST 863 guidance, where you're no longer requiring your users to arbitrarily change their password every 90 days, then you'd want to be using like Attack Simulator to see which users have selected historically bad passwords. So the combination of those two would be how I'd respond to that one.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Yeah, and then it looks like a question was already answered earlier. Someone asked about the life cycle of the PRT. That's correct. It's a 14-day duration. So basically, if an attacker ran Mimikatz, they stole the PRT, how long can they actually, go and access Office 365 with the stolen PRT? That would be limited to 14 days.
In terms of any documentation around the password brute forcing, are you aware of any already there?
For Attack Simulator, or
later? Are you aware of any documentation provided by Microsoft there? And is there any way to I guess bring awareness to it, because it's not on by default for the
right? Oh, okay. So as well as the banned password list, so the documentation here. So what I could do is I can follow up, with you after, and provide I don't have it, right off the top of my hand, but I could certainly provide the documentation links. But the short answer is yes, Microsoft does have these documented. Yep. Right. If no other questions, again, and feel free to jump in if any other questions, come in on chat or from YouTube. So we'll go over to email security. So we always start with identity first, because if identity is not secured, if MFA is not enabled and you're not doing device-based authentication, then I don't know. It's just that's the very first thing to do. It's the same as having a firewall protecting your on-premise network. So think about MFA for identity as you would a firewall for your on-premise network. So it should be seen in those terms. Sadly, the MFA adoption rate is abysmally low. So it's like people running out there with Windows directly with no firewall enabled on the internet is kind of the equivalent. So if you do MFA right, you do identity right, then the threat of a spear phishing attack should be significantly reduced if you think about it, because a phishing email is typically either trying to steal your credentials, or it's trying to get you to execute some sort of payload on the machine, right? So that's why we spent so much time on identity. If we can get identity right, then now a spear phishing is limited to the payloads running on the endpoint, not the identity, because we've solved the identity problem with MFA, if that makes sense. Now, phishing kits are pretty cheap. People are able to buy phishing kits, and we've seen so many organizations, get phished, and it's just the cost of these is low, and you don't really need any coding experience. So if you have Microsoft Office 365, which most organizations do, some organizations are using Google for email. I recognize that. And some organizations still have Exchange on premise. I don't see a lot of Zimbra or third-party email systems out there. So the majority of the clients I talk to, are using Exchange or Exchange Online. I think most businesses are. And so how do we defend that with, say, a Microsoft centric solution? So Defender for Office 365 is, you can see here, it has a variety of different levels of protection at the edge, sender-based intelligence, content filtering, post delivery. Now, I'm not going to tell you it's perfect. There is actually no perfect email security solution. spam gets by, phishing emails get by for sure. But it still means it doesn't mean you should turn it off, right? You should still have some protection. And I think it's important for everybody to recognize, though, that the detonation chamber, the sandboxing solution that vendors use, is limited to Windows. The detonation chambers are not running Mac OS or Linux, and so if your end user population is primarily Mac or primarily Linux, you need to understand that these sandboxes are not sandboxing threats on those operating systems. So that's something I don't think a lot of people are talking about when it comes to email security. And I think there was one vendor in particular that did Mac sandboxing. I want to say it was FireEye. And if anyone knows of any other vendors that do Mac sandboxing on emails, please let me know, educate me. But yeah, the Microsoft and Proofpoint, Mimecast, which are the top 3 email security vendors in the world, are not sandboxing for Mac attachments or vulnerabilities or exploits of the Mac operating system. So that's important to discuss that. And so what that means is that your endpoint security on Linux and Mac had better be really good, because you're not getting any help from a email security vendor unless you're running someone that has that capability. Microsoft does use 3 different antivirus engines to scan for known threats. And I get the question all the time, what are the AV engines that Microsoft uses? So to find that out, it's not easy, actually. You have to kind of go out of your way. And in the Security and Compliance Center, if you extract a message, say from the quarantine or the Threat Explorer tool, so you have to use Threat Explorer. And then when you download the message, you will then see a message header that normally is not displayed, and it will actually tell you the AV engines that Microsoft uses. So they actually use Symantec, Command, and Microsoft. Now, why is it important to know this? Well, it's important to know this because if you're running Symantec as your primary desktop, AV engine, and you're using Symantec for your email security, that's not very good defense in depth, right? You want to mix and match, ideally, and have different engines at different, layers in the most ideal case. Otherwise, why would it matter if you're using the same exact, AV engine for email as desktop, right? So yeah, using Threat Explorer, you can see that. Now, the service description for Microsoft states that they'll rotate these periodically. And so don't be surprised if Symantec gets rotated out, with someone else, or Command gets rotated out. You can, of course, expect Microsoft will remain as one of the 3. The service description also states they can have as many as 5 AV engines running at any given time. So 3 is the minimum, but 5 would be the maximum. And then after known threats are scanned and sandboxed, then hyperlinks are then inspected. Now, one of the vulnerabilities or issues that I found with the hyperlinks is that if you implement an IP filter, let's say you have a website that's hosting malicious code. If you implement an IP filter to block communication to the Microsoft IP ranges, then the Microsoft engine will essentially fail open. It'll allow that email through as opposed to failing close. Now, I have not tested, full disclosure, to see if they've solved that issue recently, but the last time I tested it, that was the case. The other issue with the engine is that by default, it will not block encrypted or password protected documents. So what you have to do is you have to basically create a transport rule to block password protected or encrypted attachments. And the reason that's important is because attackers obviously don't want their code sandboxed or scanned, so they'll password protect it or encrypt it. Microsoft did implement kind of a cool trick where if the password is in the body of the email, they will scrape that and use that to decrypt, a zip file and then scan the content. So I verified that does work. So an attacker can't do something as simple as a password protected zip and then name the password in the body of the email. Microsoft will use that to break it open and decrypt and scan. So this is obviously important to turn on, so at least you're getting some protection. An interesting capability that exists with this particular sandbox is when there's a malicious file found, like this HTML file that contains, shell code and is running commands and running, obfuscated, PowerShell. The hash is then shared with Defender for Endpoint. So if you're using Defender for Endpoint is your desktop, endpoint security solution, then any hashes found here for malicious content is shared there. I think that's relevant because if the attacker is trying to use multiple attack vectors, like maybe hosting a file on Dropbox and then maybe a USB drive or various things, knowing that 90% of all threat is coming through email, this will develop, a pretty rich set of malicious hash and being able to make sure that if the endpoint encounters that via other vectors, I think it's, that's an important tie-in. The alternative is, if you have like a third-party email security solution, like say a Proofpoint Mimecast, if those hashes are not being shared with whatever AV solution you have on the desktop, you're really missing out on, malicious payloads that are being found, via email. So I think that is kind of an important thing. It's important to enable, DMARC and DKIM. DMARC will basically reject emails that did not originate from authorized senders. So this is an example of a DMARC record. Only 16 to 20% of organizations have implemented DMARC, which means that they're vulnerable to impersonation. So an attacker can basically go in and send an email as that company, and the recipient, maybe it's a supplier or a customer, is going to get that email. So DMARC basically protects this part of the email in blue and does not protect the display name from getting hijacked or impersonated. So you need other technology in order to do that. So the Microsoft technology to do that is called anti-impersonation. So it's protecting, say, a display name with some kind of random external address. And it's also protecting against like typo squatted domains where someone purchases a domain with like one character off. So to fully protect against impersonation, you need both DMARC and anti-impersonation or similar features enabled. And then Microsoft does offer a automated investigation and response. So when people click on a link and you need to respond quickly, it'll kick off an investigation and allow you to purge all those emails that got through without having to use PowerShell. Normally, you'd have to use PowerShell to go and search and destroy and remove those messages. So this is a nice little automated solution here. And if you're wondering what those playbooks are, these are the 13 different playbooks that kick off during the investigation. So, did the user forward any emails that violate DLP policies? It's checking the IP reputation. It's checking. It's using clustering to see if the attacker used a different sender address to target other individuals in the same organization. So multiple different techniques to find out what other emails may have also come in. If you want to test this next to your solution, you can turn on an evaluation mode. This is because a lot of organizations are really nervous about switching their email security solution. They're nervous because, am I going to get more spam or am I going to get more phishing if I make a switch? So eval mode allows you to basically run a what if scenario. And so Microsoft would basically issue reports on what they would have caught had you put them, in stream. You can also run the Orca tool. Orca tool is a PowerShell module that basically checks all your configuration against best practices. This has been replaced by just the native configuration analyzer that's right in Defender for Office. So you no longer have to run the PowerShell module, but I still like the PowerShell module. There's a lot of really good recommendations that Orca presents. And while there's probably 70 different options or configuration things to really harden email security with Microsoft, they now offer this kind of easy button. You could basically set up your email in either strict mode or standard mode. So you can also basically say, for my privileged users, I want strict mode, and then for my standard users, everyone else goes standard. So pretty easy. You basically turn it on, you target the group, and it's basically going to use Microsoft's strongest recommendations for security. And if you want to know what those are, then this particular hyperlink here describes and breaks down what is strict, what is standard, what is it really doing behind the scenes. So email best practices, at a minimum, we do recommend, something scanning for malware, spam. We think sandbox and link inspection is pretty important, obviously. We do think it's important to block impersonated senders, because CEO fraud, business email compromise, a lot of attacks are financially motivated, where the attacker's trying to do a wire fraud, or direct deposit fraud, gift card fraud. Various financial techniques could be prevented. Not all of them, but many of them can be thwarted with good email hygiene records. And then automating response, because no solution's ever going to get it perfect. So when something does get through, if you can automate the response and orchestrate, Microsoft provides a good, few solutions there. Running the Orca tool, making sure all your configuration is good, spotting misconfigurations, running simulated phishing exercises, which is, I guess, debatable, the efficacy. I've seen studies that state that phishing exercises can reduce click rates from 20 to 50%, all the way down to like 5%. So I probably would still advocate for phishing exercises, simulated phishing. But I'm seeing some studies that are kind of debating the efficacy of those. So I guess it's up for debate. I'd be curious what you guys think on that. But I do think it's important to redirect encrypted email via transport rule, because if you don't, then anything password protected or encrypted is not going to be scanned by Microsoft. And of course, blocking common executable attachments. Now, Microsoft did disable email forwarding last fall. So in the past, what attackers love to do is, after an account takeover, they would basically forward email to an external email address, and that was very common. So Microsoft actually shut that off. And I've seen a couple organizations turn it back on, and those organizations that did ended up having account takeovers, and the attackers did use that. So be very careful if you re-enable email forwarding, for sure. All right, let's go ahead and keep pushing through to, actually, let me pause here. Anyone on the Zoom or on YouTube have any unanswered questions so far on email security best practices before we move on to endpoint? Okay, let's go ahead and move on. Endpoint security. We're going to focus today on this one particular, solution. Of course, there's many other endpoint security solutions, but if you own, again, today's whole theme is Microsoft 365 security. So when you buy the E5 license from Microsoft M365 E5, they actually give you a EDR solution. They give you Defender for Endpoint. So we're going to talk about, if you bought that license, how to configure that according to best practice. And I'll try to do it in 10 minutes or less. I want to try to wrap up in about 10 minutes or so.
Real quick, Joe, we had
Sure.
one question off YouTube. Does it log anything that is detected and blocked prior to this the Defender topic?
So does it log anything detected and blocked? Yes. if you go to security.microsoft.com and then on the left navigation, incidents or alerts will be where you'll go to find anything that Defender for Office blocks for, say, phishing and whatnot. There's also really, really good reporting now. The reporting was actually pretty poor, and it was what I think Gartner marked Microsoft down on their email security reporting. There's some really good new reports that have become available to identify that too, of as far as what is blocking phishing versus malware and whatnot. All right, good, great questions. Okay, so Defender for Endpoint. So what's really funny here is when Microsoft decided to use the Defender name, Defender didn't always have the best reputation in security. And I was one of the advocates that tried to convince them to pick anything other than Defender, because I thought that a lot of security folks would not take it seriously if they stuck with the Defender name. It's despite the name Defender, because it again was probably not your first pick as an AV solution a few years ago. Despite the name, it's actually gained some pretty solid, reputation. What's really interesting here is the August 2019 Gartner Magic Quadrant compared to the May 2021. Microsoft and CrowdStrike 3 years ago were considered, top two. But look at what happened in the last couple of years. Microsoft and CrowdStrike have really kind of separated themselves from the field, and it's really interesting what's happened over the last 3 years. And then the Forrester Magic Quadrant that came out again is CrowdStrike, Microsoft, and Trend are very very close. And then comparing Defender to, say, CrowdStrike, MITRE comes out every year or two with evaluation where they compare these EDR solutions kind of head to head. And the last evaluation, they looked at Fin7 and Financially Motivated APT Group. This Defender detected 356 TTPs compared to CrowdStrike's 231. So they're both very high, compared to the others in the field. They're both, really good. But all that being said, Microsoft is definitely doing a really good job. What I like to do, and I have to give credit to my colleague Zach Moore, who I believe is listening. What Zach did is he basically took the Microsoft kind of best practices for really locking things down, and then he downloaded a malware simulator. And so he set up a lab, Windows 10 Pro, just default, right? This is the free edition of Defender, running just Defender with no EDR. He then set up a Windows 10 system with Defender, and then he set it up with where we applied all the best practices like ASR rules and block at first sight, and I'll kind of go through some of those things. So basically 3 different systems. And so then he kicked off the ransomware simulator to see how it, did. With the free edition, 61% of the files were encrypted with just the out-of-the-box free edition of Windows 10 Defender. When you enable Defender EDR, it reduced the number of files encrypted to 49%, so a marginal improvement. But when you actually enabled the settings to really lock down Defender, the malware simulator wouldn't even run. So that's actually what you want. You don't want ransomware to kick off. 50% of your files being encrypted is not good. So the moral of the story here is just turning on Defender, for endpoint is not sufficient to guard against, ransomware. You need to turn on, block at first sight. Block at first sight is off by default, so you have to go in and turn it on. And essentially what it does is, it uploads the file to, the cloud. It does a metadata, analysis on it. It'll do sample-based ML. It'll do full detonation. And if you do this, if you turn this on, it's very, very effective. So you can deploy it with Intune, SCCM, which is now Microsoft Endpoint Manager, Group Policy, inside of Intune, just go into device restrictions, configure, and then these are the settings. So cloud level, cloud delivered protection enabled, file blocking high. Give it up to 50 seconds to complete those ML checks and the detonation, and submit the files without prompting. So this is basically the configuration profile to turn on block at first sight, which again, based on Zach's testing, is extremely effective at preventing ransomware from getting off the ground. So that would be about as good as you can get. We do recommend turning on the attack surface reduction rules. We talked about one of them in particular that was really effective at blocking the past the PRT, which would have been this one: block credential stealing from Windows Local Security Authority, LSAS. And this is good. Obviously, if we can prevent Adobe Reader from spawning PowerShell, that's always a great idea, right? Preventing Office from spawning PowerShell. There's good. The best practice here is you want to turn them on in audit mode for 30 days, collect, what valid processes you probably need to exclude. And being careful with your exclusions, like we learned on the Kaseya attack, where Kaseya said, hey, please exclude all these folders and files and everything. You need to be careful with the exclusions, but you do also need to make sure you're not breaking your business apps from launching. Right. So Defender for Endpoint definitely has really good EDR capability. It has the ability to isolate computers, and it can really detect a wide number of signals, as we saw from the MITRE analysis. And then if you're defending against human operated ransomware, the ASR rules in combination of like LAPS and MFA, these are all really good things to prevent that initial access. So this is basically how ASR would map and align to preventing human operated ransomware, the various kind of MITRE attack lexicon mentioned here. And my colleagues would kill me if I didn't mention probably one of the most important features to enable, which is tamper protection. From our testing, this would have prevented the Kaseya attack. The Kaseya attack tampered with Defender by disabling real-time AV. And then the loader then spawned a ransomware file from within the CRT that was created. So if tamper protection had been enabled based on our testing, then that attack would not have got off the ground for those Kaseya customers that were running Defender. So tamper protection can be enabled via two different methods. One is with Intune, and the other one is actually in the Defender security portal. Why is this so effective? It's effective because even if you're a local administrator or you have system, then you cannot prevent the real-time AV from running. You can't tamper, can't turn it off. Registry keys, PowerShell. Now, if any of you have defeated this, if you know of a bypass, I would love to learn of that and test it. Just so we can, again, make sure that everybody's fully informed, of any threats against this. So if, again, please share if anyone does know of any bypass techniques to disable tamper protection. So, tamper protection can be enabled like on a home edition, right? That's not what I'm referring to. I'm referring to enabling it with Intune or as a global setting. Those two is where it's actually signing a payload that can only be undone from a Intune administrator. Okay, and you can also enable tamper protection now globally. So this is a new setting. In the past, you could only deploy it with Intune. And a lot of customers are like, well, what if I don't have Intune? What if I'm using AirWatch? So now you can actually just turn it on directly in the security product without having to rely on Intune. The trade-off is that this is a global setting. There's not a group exclusion or a way to phase roll this out. So this would be, the trade-off here is the global on-off. Ransomware has obviously been a pretty big topic lately. So this slide I like the slide because it shows the variety of different features that you can turn on. I think Application Guard is really important because you're virtualizing the web browser so that if the user goes on a malvertising link, or they click on a link, goes to a website, however they get to a malicious website with malicious code, it's containerizing that and preventing the underlying operating system from getting hacked. Now, full disclosure, I don't know many organizations that are live and in production with this. We're actually rolling it out now in my company, and we're beginning to test this. But I think, yeah, if you can containerize the web browsing, that's going to be good. There is an extension to Chrome that allows you to use this. Otherwise, it's already natively built into Microsoft Chromium Edge. Tax production rules we talked about. Defender, of course. So, and then if you're using known folder move and all your files are backed up to OneDrive, then you can, restore to a point in time to recover to the previous day. Let me actually just go to the final slide here. Ask me anything. So we talked about, protecting identity, protecting email, and protecting the endpoint. There's so much more that I could have talked about. Literally, I spent half the day today deleting slides that I wanted to share with you. So I thought what I would do is present, links, and we'll make this, Stephen, I'll share with you the PowerPoint so that all these links work, obviously. But there's webinars that we've done where we go super deep. We partnered with Florian Roth, author of Nextron's Thor APT scanner, on one of these to really go through some of these pretty deep live demonstration of moving off ADFS. So a lot of really good webinar, a lot of content we want to share with everyone, and conditional access best practices. And I have a book coming out hopefully this fall. If you want to basically sign up to pre-order, you can find that at bit.ly order security book. And it's all about the content we talked about today, but much, much greater depth. And because we were time constrained today. Want to thank you guys for having me, and thanks for letting me go a little long here. And we'll just, I guess, open it up to Q&A, or Stephen, you can wrap us up.
Q&A it is. We were dealing with OBS crashing towards the tail end there. The last couple slides, it just died on us, so the YouTube stream died. But I pasted everything, all the questions we got from YouTube live in the channel there. In terms of the sandbox email, there was a couple comments around Barracuda and Talon doing it as well.
So that they're claiming, I guess, that Barracuda is sandboxing the Mac operating system vulnerabilities and exploits. That's quite interesting. I wasn't aware of that, so I'll have to look into that.
But yeah, I mean, it's definitely a lot of information. That the PRTs really caught my attention. I tend to abuse a lot of the access tokens I get from CLI. So the PRT tokens, I know Podcat threw in there that it was a 14-day life cycle on those. But yeah, it seems it seems like there's always just another way to obtain some sort of token to abuse permissions. When you not just even Azure, it's an AWS as well, but it seems that's like the hottest attack vector for discovering access and escalating.
Absolutely. Yeah, it bypasses so many controls, right?
Anyone else have any other questions for Joe? Going once? Going twice? You all have ransomware now? Please provide 2 Bitcoins to get your keys. Oh, so did you make a plug for your securing M365 book?
I did. Yeah, please, if you're interested, love to share the knowledge of what we've learned on this. So bit.ly order security book.
All right, beautiful. I will post that as well on Twitter and in the chat room.
Thank you.
I'll be reaching out to our Zoom sponsor here and obtaining the recording and replacing the YouTube video for that, so everything's clear and concise, and this can be referenced.
Outstanding.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Joe, for taking the time to come out and spend a Thursday evening with us. I mean, I was pinging Steven on the side. I mean, just a wealth of knowledge coming out in every possible way. So thank you again. It's definitely something I'm going to reference. And if no one has any other questions, we'll go ahead and wrap up the session today.
Excellent. Thanks for having me. Have a nice evening.
Anytime. Take care, everyone.
Yes.